Sound like it's on. There it is. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
We are beginning our summer quarter. Appreciate Randy and Ernest and all of those who taught last quarter, and give them a break now, and we'll go on to other things, and I'm sure you'll see them again soon. I appreciate their work and the things that they do. We'll get into our topic here in just a moment as we get all settled in and everything, and glad you're here this morning, ready to go. And let's have a word of prayer before we begin, and we'll get started. Father, we're grateful for this day. We're thankful for our time of study today. We pray for all of those who are engaged in such studies at this time. Bless us the next hour as we worship you in spirit and in truth. Bless all of those who are in need of our prayers, and it's in Jesus' name. Amen. Do something for me this morning. Usually I'd have up here or have you turning to a particular passage and would have you get ready to study a particular book. Open to Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4. We will see what we can get into right there. Now, Malachi chapter 4, and I want you to take that page that Malachi 4 is on. That's the last book of the Old Testament for if it's a little early for you. And I want you to turn one page over from Malachi 4. Now, if you have a study Bible like mine, there might be some other sections about, what happened, how we got the New Testament or something about the Old Testament. But maybe you might have to go 2 or 3 pages until you get to this page that looks, in mine, just says the New Testament. Usually yours probably has like a page, 2, or like mine, 3 or 4 that are in between. And what I want to do this quarter is study that page or those 2 or 3 pages that are in between Malachi and the beginning of Matthew, because there's a lot of things that you and I can learn from that single page that divides Malachi from Matthew. For example, answer the questions that we'll have here on the screen, and hopefully by the time we are finished, you can answer these because they're all found on that single page between Malachi and Matthew. Why are people in the New Testament, when we get there, I know they speak a few other languages, but why are they mainly speaking Greek, even though they're ruled by Romans who would speak Latin? At least the more educated class would. Why are most people speaking Greek? If we go from Malachi, that's not a language that most people are speaking. What happens between Malachi 4 and Matthew 1 that causes so many people to be speaking Greek, even though they're ruled by Romans? We've talked about this in the beginning of the class I taught on Luke. It's been a couple of quarters ago. But where did all of the Jewish sects come from? When you finish Malachi 4, you don't read about people like Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, a bunch of other different groups that are there. And then when you open up the pages of the New Testament, it doesn't even explain where they come from because they are so ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're so common. The writers of the New Testament did not even need to explain anything about it because they're already there. Where'd they come from? That single page between Malachi and Matthew tells us where they came from. What's the synagogue, and why is it so important in the New Testament? You do not read the word synagogue in the Old Testament. It wasn't something that God commanded. He didn't send Moses down or any of the prophets down a plan for what the synagogue was. And yet when you get to the book of Acts, it is the place that Paul goes every time he goes into a new city in order to begin spreading the gospel. What is the synagogue? Why was it so important in the New Testament, and something that still exists today in the Jewish religion? That single page between Malachi and Matthew tells us where the synagogue came from. Why are the Jews so desperate when it comes to finding or waiting for a Messiah? We do not read in the Old Testament of the Jews looking for a Messiah, this anointed one that was coming as a deliverer. And yet when we open up the pages of the New Testament, they are constantly looking for this Messiah. Jesus was not the first person that the Jews or some group of Jews thought was the Messiah. There were dozens of people between Malachi and Matthew that people looked to and said, this is him. This is the deliverer. This is the anointed one. This is the Messiah. And so when we open up the New Testament in Matthew, without learning about that page that's there in the middle, we kind of look at it as Jesus as kind of this unique figure, and he is in a lot of ways, but as a Messiah, he's not, because there were a bunch of them. But when they start saying, this is the Messiah, this is him that Moses and the prophets spake, they probably said that about a lot of people, because everybody was looking, who's going to be the deliverer, and what's he delivering us from? And so that one single page there tells us a lot about why they were so desperate looking for this one. And if we would study that particular page right there, I think it would help our understanding. At least it has mine, and I wanted to give that to you. What about crucifixion? Where does it come from? And why was it the designated, or was it the designated means of execution under the Roman Empire? Where does it come from? Why was it in use? We don't read about it in the Old Testament. Did it exist in some form during that time? And why was it something that, as we'll see, where the cross was, that Golgotha, was the place where they crucified the people that were to be crucified. But it was the place where there was always a vertical piece of wood sticking out of the ground. Jesus didn't carry the entire cross. He actually just carried that cross piece, just the one part that kind of crosses the T. That's what he carried. The part that was in the ground always stayed there, because they used it so much, it was already ready to go. All they just had to do was nail the hands to the cross piece and put it on top in a place that was fixed there. Where did that come from? And why was that something that they chose for their worst criminals, people like Barabbas, who was scheduled to be crucified, and so many others? Where'd that come from? That single page between Malachi and Matthew tells us a lot. We've talked about Herod as well during our study of Luke, but it would be good to look at it in this context as well. But why was Herod called king of the Jews in the New Testament? Who is Herod? Why is he called the king, and yet we know that the Romans are the ones in charge? What's the dynamics as far as the politics are concerned when we get to the New Testament? And we'll look at some of these and other questions as well. And why, I had you turn to Malachi 4, and the beginning of New Testament. Anybody know how many years, give or take, there are between Malachi and Matthew? We'll say 400. I think I've got 440 up here. 4 centuries where God did not speak to man, at least directly through a prophet or directly through heads of household or anything like that. God does not speak for 400 years. Why? Why were there no prophets after Malachi? And how did God still work in the world before Jesus came? How is it that he worked during that time? And did he leave himself a witness? God doesn't leave himself without someone speaking for him or without his speaking for himself. Did he speak during that 400 years or so? And how was it different than other times? So I think if we look at that particular page that's right there, there are a lot of things that you and I can learn. We call that one page, and I'm going to keep referring to it as the page, we call it the Intertestamental period. Obviously, you can see the name there. It's between the Testaments. And as with other studies that we do, this is not something that is essential for us. All of those questions that I ask, you do not need to know the answer to those to know what God needs you to do as far as salvation, as far as worship, as far as things like that. However, there are a lot of things that we can look at. Some of it is extra biblical, outside the Bible, that can help our understanding. We can read through the New Testament, as hopefully you do, beginning of the year or whatever it is, and what you read there is what you need to know. But there are a lot of things that could help our understanding. You don't need to know Greek to know what you need to do in order to be saved and that sort of thing. But if you know it, it helps your understanding with a lot of words that we find and things like that. And so this intertestamental period is something that kind of helps us see. We leave off about 400 years before Jesus, and then on the scene here in Matthew, or as Mark presents him, Jesus just burst on the scene, and there's all these differences that take place. Understand that 400 years is a long time. What we, as a country, was our 249th birthday or something like that just a couple of days ago. That was a long time ago, but that's just over half of the time period between Malachi and Matthew. A lot can change. And so during this study, during our time together, during the next few weeks, we will aspire to try to sum up some of the things that happen in between to get our connection from one to the other. That's something that interests me, and I've learned over the years that things that interest me don't interest other people. But this has been a benefit to me and others that where I've taught it. It's been helpful. So hopefully it is to you as well. I thought before we did that, however, we would kind of get our bearings of where we are. One of the things I think that frustrates people when you study history is no matter what you're studying or what you're reading about, you always have to go backwards and get your bearings. If we wanted to talk about the United States in the year 1900, well, we would have to know what happened the few decades before that, what happened in order to get us to 1900. And then before that, we would have to learn about the Civil War and the things, and then before that, we would have to go backwards, and now your eyes start to roll back in your head. But it's always beneficial for us to kind of understand where we've been, to know where we are, and then to see where we're going. And so that's kind of what we want to do this morning, is to kind of place ourselves where our study is going to take place. We'll do a quick intro to the class itself, and then I'm sure the time will be close to being up. The intertestamental period, the time period that we're looking at here, is not something that just sprang onto the record. There's nothing in history that happens that just out of nothing, here comes something. There are a lot of things that took place in order to bring it to where it exists. And so people like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and all of these people are during that one page that we're going to be talking about. This was a larger series of events that you have to go back to Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, places like that we're not going to look at primarily. But these all acting in this region that we call the Israel, Palestine, that area, is what brings about Jesus and what brings about the time period that God was looking for to establish his kingdom on earth. So a quick overview of where we've been, I think will kind of help us anyway. And maybe if you've not looked at it like this, maybe this will be beneficial as well. Let's have a timeline going from the beginning to Jesus. And so we'll put it one in creation. I've got 6,000 BC. I know people that would put it before that, and people say that's way too early or late, and so they'd move it forward. A bishop in 500-600 years ago, Bishop Unger, decided that he had discovered when the earth was created down to the minute. It was sometime in October 4004 BC. That's when he decided it was. So, whatever. There's our creation, is right there at the beginning of the timeline, and then we're going to move forward to Jesus' birth. I've got that Jesus was born in the year 1. Surprisingly, perhaps to you, and we'll talk about this when we get there, but Jesus was probably born in 4 BC or 6 BC, depending on how you look at it. So Jesus was born 4 years before Jesus was born. That's strange, that's weird, but the time that we've put time on a scale and we've missed some dates. And so Jesus was born probably a few years before we have him being born. But for our purpose today, I'll put him at the year 1. That he was born there. And so if we have that time period, and this is kind of what we're narrowing down the years that we're looking at, we'll put the flood at around 4,000 again. That's not something that is set in stone, but around that time period, we will have it. So if we zoom in and push some of those things to the outside, inside between the flood and Jesus, the Bible talks from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11. And it has this, God created the heavens and the earth, the universe. And then it narrows down until it's talking about a single family. And for the last quarter of the book of Genesis, it talks about a single person, Joseph. And so we're focusing in here. Abraham, we'll put roughly around 2200 BC, somewhere around in there. And his descendant, the one that Genesis focuses on more than anyone else, is Joseph. And we'll put him at around 1900. And we're using some of the dates that Stephen talks about in the book of Acts, and we're using some other dates that aren't in the Bible to try to narrow some of that down. Time periods, dates and years, not really important when we're looking at that. That's why we're not told them. However, they're dated around this time period, and so I'll just kind of accept them. That's a more moderate view of some of these. So there's 1900 years between Joseph going into Egypt and becoming second in command and saving the people that are there in Egypt. And so what happens in between that time period? A lot can go on there. We're going to date the Exodus, the time of Moses and the people leaving, around 1450. I've seen it earlier, I've seen it later, and so I kind of put it in the middle there. That's another one of those dates that we're not sure about. Exodus at around 1450. Again, understand that the dates that Stephen uses in Acts chapter 7 when he's giving the history of the people, that's beneficial here as well. And so 40 years later, we'll give them some time period, so some time to leave Egypt, wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and then also to go and conquer the land. The book of Joshua is this time period right here. So around 1400, they conquered the land. The Bible says that they did all that God commanded them, and they conquered, they drove out the people, most of them anyway. And so that's around there, 1400. Zooming in a little more, because we've got just 1400 years here between conquering the land and Jesus. So the prophet Samuel, we have all of the judges between that time, 1400, until Samuel being the last prophet. And I'm more exact here, 1080. That doesn't mean that's exactly right. But because we know that Saul was king for 40 years, David was 40, and Solomon was 40. And then we start into empires that we can date pretty specifically. I'll put Samuel at around 1080. And so this is the time period of Samuel when he was the judge of Israel, and God had him anoint a couple of kings that would be coming along the way. Speaking of that king, there is Saul. that's a very specific date of 1051 to 1011. I've seen a few years one way or the other, so that's why I put him right there. He was king for 40 years, also David and also Solomon, all of those. So 120 years, the nation of the kingdom of Israel was one united kingdom. And so that's 120 years that are there. So there's Saul at around 1050. David, the great king of Israel, will date him at 1011 to 971. So whatever date you want to put him at around there, he's 40 years was his reign. Might be going through these too quickly. Let me know. And then, of course, his son Solomon being the last of the united kingdom. So again, 40 years between each of those three. And so now we have about 930 years between Solomon and Jesus coming. And so again, all of this is covered, the parts that we need to know anyway, in our Old Testament. None of this is new. None of this is something necessarily that we need to go extra biblical for. That kingdom is divided when Solomon dies. Remember that his son Rehoboam took over for him and divided the kingdom because he was very harsh. And so the southern kingdoms remained with him. Jeroboam took the 10 tribes in the north, and so there is this wrenching of the kingdom. It's being torn in two. And so it begins in 931 or so, and it goes until Babylon eventually takes the southern kingdom away. They'll be on the timeline here in just a moment. So here we have this 930 years. And again, we're still zooming in. We're going to look at the last 400, but we're getting our place here on the timeline. Here's where we get to the point where we can dig in the ground and we can find evidence for these places and people. Not that we couldn't find evidence for the people previously, but we can narrow down dates very, very quickly because we're really sure of when these things took place. The nation of Assyria, the empire, is the very first world empire. If you study ancient history, Egypt's going to be a big one, but Assyria is really the first major world empire. They had the city of Nineveh, and they from there began to expand to where they go to the east, all the way to Persia, present-day Iran, and they go to the west, and they start to conquer lands that way. Iraq is where Nineveh would be today, but they go into Jordan and Syria and some of Israel in order to expand their empire. And so in the year 722, that's when they come and they take Israel, the northern kingdom. So when you talk about Isaiah in around 750 or so, that's when Isaiah is there. And so Assyria comes and they take the northern kingdom. And so from 722, 721 until Babylon, 150, 200 years later, the southern kingdom is by itself. And so they are alone in as far as Israel has been taken away, so it's just Judah. And then, again, if you'll notice there on that timeline, we've got Assyria, and now we've got Babylon. We're not going to talk about it, but Assyria has now fallen, the Battle of Karkar with Assyria and Babylon. Babylon now becomes the major player in the region. They are also in Iraq, but they are the newest empire, and they take Assyria, and then they continue to conquer further and further west. Keep in mind that a lot of these major empires, the thing they're trying to do is feed their people. And the way that you have to feed your people is you need more land, and you need more places to grow your food, and the best place to grow food is Egypt. And so everybody, if we're looking at a map, everybody's trying to go to the west. Over here on the left side, that's where Egypt is, and Israel and Judah are just in the middle. And so a lot of the problems that Israel and Judah face from outside comes from the fact that they're just located right at the crossroads of all of these empires trying to get to each other. And it's not that Judah and Israel are really small, comparatively speaking, but they're trying to get to Egypt, and they're just in the way. And so Assyria taking Israel, that was part of their trying to get to Egypt. Babylon taking Judah is part of that as well. And so in the year 606, it's an important date. That's the very first time that Babylon comes and takes Judah. But what would happen is, we're used to, in modern warfare, we can fight anywhere in the world at any time, especially with our technology. And so there's not a season for war. But in the ancient world, there were only a few months of the year that you could fight. Not just because of seasons like winter and things like that, but because you ran out of food. And if you don't have food to feed your army, you're in trouble. And so they would fight for a few months out of the year, and then they would go back home, resupply, and wait for better weather, and then they would go and try to expand further than they did the previous year. And so 606 is the first time that Babylon comes and takes Judah. They attack Jerusalem, and they take it, and they carry away the very best of the spoils back to Babylon. This is when Daniel is first taken. He's one of the educated, the healthy, the young, and so he's carried away in 606. But they actually return 2 more times to get more and more of the spoils. And so 606 was the first time. We're counting back or down because we're going to Jesus. 597 is the next time, and then 586 is the last time. And here is where they take everything. They destroy the temple more than it was before. This is the end of the kings of Judah. They had put a puppet king on the throne. Who was it? Zedekiah, Jehoiakim. I'm going through my kings there. One of the last ones there. And they made him their puppet. He didn't do what they wanted, and so they took him off and just destroyed the whole place. And so that's 586, and those 3 dates are important for those who, when you look at the history of the Jews, and that's the last time that Babylon carried them away. But remember that Jeremiah said that they would be in captivity how long? 70 years. They would be in captivity for 70 years. Now, how was that, did that come to pass? How do we reckon that? Well, the first time they were carried away, the very first people from Judah to be carried into captivity took place in 606. And in the year 536, and again, we have a new empire comes on the scene. This is Persia. The Persian Empire releases Judah in 536, exactly 70 years from the first carrying away until they are released. In the year 539, Persia takes over. They destroy Babylon. They become the new empire there. And a few years later, in 536, the king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, releases the people and says, go back to your homelands. I'm still in charge. You're still paying me taxes. But rebuild your temples, rebuild your homes. He did that as kind of a goodwill offering. And Judah was a very small part of that empire. However, Jeremiah 70 years earlier, or before that even, had proclaimed, you're going into captivity, and in 70 years you're going to return. An incredible prophecy that took place there. It was impossible to know that from Jeremiah's standpoint, that would take place exactly that number of years later. But there's 536. So again, we're making our way through the Old Testament. We're now at Daniel. Ezekiel's in this time period as well, some of these others that are there. And now we get into some of the minor prophets, because when we get to Malachi, we've got about 90 years after they've been released where some of these minor prophets fit back into the historical line that we've been looking at. So when you get to the end of 2 Chronicles, you've basically read all of this timeline up to this point. The rest of them afterwards, the Psalms and Proverbs and Jonahs and all the other Obadiahs, all the others, they fit back on this timeline somewhere. Perhaps if you have a study Bible, you find the timeline said a lot better than I have and in more detail. But at this point, after Persia releases the Jewish people, the word Jew comes from the word Judah, the people of Judah back to rebuild their homeland, we have about 450 years of where God doesn't really say anything. Malachi being the last prophet, he had some specific things to say to the people that were still in captivity, because not everybody left. People wanted to stay, but many did, and so you have some of those who returned to build the wall of Jerusalem, and Ezra, Nehemiah, some of those. So when you get to the right there, that's it. And now God doesn't speak for 400, and I've got a very exact 444 years. And so this is our time period. All of those things have happened. These empires have risen and they've fallen. Prophecies have been given, and we've seen them come to pass. There are many, many other prophecies at this point that have not been fulfilled, because there's one that's coming and he's going to fulfill a bunch of them. But there are a few prophecies that take place inside of this intertestamental period that we do not see. For example, the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, Daniel chapter 2. Remember that statue, the head of fine gold? Most of that statue has already been built by the time we get to Jesus. And so by looking at this page of this intertestamental period, we can see that Daniel had it exactly right, that Nebuchadnezzar's dream foretold of what would take place during this time period. There's also another chapter in the book of Daniel that tells us some things that happened in this time period, and that's not as well known as the statue is. But all of that, a lot of this takes place, and this is one single page or a couple more in your Bible, and it's probably blank. And so we'll be looking at this time period here during this class. Any questions, comments on what I just had up there? I want to give us a why to as we close our class here. And so this intertestamental period is about 440 years that are silent between Malachi and the beginning of the New Testament. It's not silent historically. We know a lot about what happened during this time period, and it kind of helps build our understanding of the New Testament when we get, hopefully when we learn about things like the synagogue or the Pharisees or the Herodians or the Hasmoneans or some of these words that might be foreign to you. When you read about them in the New Testament, hopefully it will help you understand more about either why they're so important or why people are doing certain things, certain ways. There's no synagogue in the Old Testament. Where does it come from? Why are they speaking Greek, and why is that important? And so all of that hopefully will be answered during this time period. Let me give you a few reasons why I think this is important. Again, it's not essential. You can leave the class and never learn any of this stuff, and you'll still be okay. But I think this is important because, first of all, it connects Malachi to Matthew. 4 centuries plus of silence where there is nothing that's said by God, and we're just kind of thrown into the mix. Again, that's intentional, but it helps build a bridge between one time period to another. Imagine if you were reading American history and you were reading about George Washington and the wigs and the clothing that they wore and the horses, and then the next thing you read about was, 1969, the United States lands on the moon. Well, okay, well, here we go. How did we get from one place to the other? It kind of builds that bridge of understanding between the two. It also, along those same lines, helps to explain the origins of a lot of the peoples and ideologies. When you understand what the Pharisees believed, who they are, where they came from, It helps to understand why they dislike Jesus so much. Understanding why people do things a lot of times is really important. And while understanding what they believe is not going to make it okay, we kind of can say, oh, that's why they hated him so much, because they believed wrongly about this. And so when Jesus comes, he kind of explodes their understanding. And a lot of people, because they had built up who the Messiah was, Jesus wasn't that, and therefore they said, well, this is like all the others, so let's get him out of the way, and there's a new one that's coming soon. And so that kind of helps our understand, because these were real people who did real things, who felt real things, wanted real things, and so it kind of helps build our understanding of that. Again, along those same lines, understand the first century mindset of the Jews. As I've said many times, people are exactly the same. Go back to any point on that blue timeline I had just a minute ago. Put your finger on it. People at that time were exactly like they are right now. However, cultures, societies change, and they do almost constantly. And so to go back 2,000 years, put ourselves in the mind of people at that time. What were they thinking? What was Nathan and Andrew and Peter and some of those others, what were they thinking when someone said, this is the Messiah? What did that mean to them? We, because we are 2,000 years removed and we know the whole gospel account, it's different for us. And it's hard for us to kind of put that genie back in the bottle. And so studying this time period gives us a chance to kind of say, okay, what was Andrew thinking when he was, this is the Messiah? What did that mean to him? Let's look at that as we examine this page here. And I told you we would eventually read a Bible verse. Our theme verse for this whole class is going to be Galatians 4 and 5. Because there's a very important word in Galatians 4 and 5. I'll have it here on the screen right here. Or it's a phrase, not a word. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. The phrase I want to focus on is the phrase fullness of time. When the fullness of time had come. Someone translate that into a better, perhaps your translation says something. What's the fullness of time mean? At the right time. When all things were ready, God sent forth his Son. Why did Jesus not come to earth the moment Adam bit that fruit? Because things weren't ready. Why did he not come to earth when David was on the throne or when Abraham was walking around? Why did he come at the time of Malach? Why didn't he come then? Why did God wait the thousands of years before Jesus came? Because things were not ready. Imagine going to a dinner party and going and sitting at the table 3 hours before anything's ready. Well, you're there, but you're not going to enjoy the dinner yet. And then when they've just put the food in the oven, well, I'm going to go sit down at the table now. Well, it's not ready. It's only when everything has been laid out and everything's put exactly where it needs to be that now we can begin. And so Matthew opens, the fullness of time has fully come. Everything's ready. However, there's 400 years where we don't understand why this is here and this is here and this is here. Why did God wait until the time when Jesus came to finally send his Son? And so there's a lot of answers that this study will hopefully give to those questions. The Greek language was the first language really that everyone spoke. And so it was helpful to be able to write in Greek because far more people could understand it than if Jesus had been sent even 150 years earlier. And there's a lot of things like that where we say, look, this is the perfect time. If he had waited longer, this wouldn't have been the case. If he had sent him earlier, there would have been a problem, and it wouldn't have caught on as well. God knew what he was doing from the beginning, and the study of this class, hopefully, will get you to see, you know what? That was the perfect time because of all the stuff that happened that we can read about, but also this 400 years of silence that God has there. Some key events as we get to the end here of our class. Some of these things that we will mention or that we'll talk about that have a bearing on this time period. Some of it takes place a little bit before, like for example, the Persians begin ruling there in 539, but also some of these other things that the Bible doesn't mention because it's during that silent period. However, they have an enormous bearing on the New Testament. 331, Alexander the Great, I say he's a Greek, he was actually a Macedonian, but he took on the Greek culture as his own, and he spreads it everywhere. Alexander the Great, the Greeks were the next in line after the Persians, and he goes all the way to almost India, spreading Greek culture. And that's the reason why there's Greek language in Israel, where they speak, several different languages, Hebrew and that kind of thing. But Greek is spread by Alexander. 323, Alexander dies, and they have to divide his kingdom up into various sections. And that causes strife in what is now Israel, and they revolt against their conquerors so many times that eventually Rome has to come and say, you know what, that's it. We're taking over, and you guys are going to quit all this revolting. There's the Maccabean revolt. Perhaps you've heard of the Maccabees, or what's the holiday, Hanukkah, that happens. This is what happens here during that silent period. The part of what is now Israel revolted. How many times? I don't know how many times they revolted against their conquerors. It was a problem area. And that's one of the reasons they were looking for a Messiah. There's going to be someone that's coming that's going to drive out the Greeks. And another one that's going to come and he's going to drive out the Syrians. And another one he's going to drive out the Romans. And so they were looking for a conqueror because of all of these revolutions that they had attempted and were, for the most part, failures at. And then when Jesus comes, they say, here he is, this is him. But he doesn't look like a conqueror. He doesn't have any experience in the military. In fact, he just looks like he's given up. This is not him. And so they are done with him, and they're looking for someone else. And the history of this area will kind of help us understand their mindset. And then, as I said, the Romans were the ones who were in charge. That begins about 60 years or so before Jesus. The Romans, through the General Pompey, who lost against Julius Caesar as far as who would be the more prominent person going forward. But he eventually comes and takes Jerusalem. And so for 60 years, even though they spoke Greek, they were basically under Roman control. And I've said this before, but it's always humorous to me when Jesus tells the Pharisees that the truth will set them free. And they say, we're Abraham's seed. We've never been in bondage to any man. All of those empires that I put up on the timeline, all of them had put Israel in bondage. But to say we're Israel's seed, we've never been in bondage to any man, there probably were Roman soldiers marching through the streets at that exact moment that they were saying they've never been in bondage. But understanding this time period gets you to see some of the humorous things that we'll see. One final thing here, and then we'll finish up. Some of the subjects that we're going to touch on, that we're going to notice. I've already mentioned it, but Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where there was a head of fine gold, there was a chest and belly, and there were thighs, and there were feet, and made of different elements. And then this stone was cut out of the mountain, and it fell on the feet, and the whole statue crumbled. Nebuchadnezzar said, I don't even know what that means. And so Daniel came to him and said, you, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, but referring mainly to Babylon, you are the head of fine gold. But after you will come other kingdoms, other nations will rise, and then in the days of these kings, he's referring to the feet, there's going to be a kingdom that is established which will never be destroyed. And so if we follow that statue, that schedule that's there, we can know when the kingdom was supposed to be established, and we can see the line of all the others. Now, after Persia, the second empire, the chest and arms, the Bible's silent. They're just, for 400 years, we don't read of anything else, and then we're already at the feet when Matthew opens. In this class, we'll notice the other parts of that statue to see that Daniel was absolutely right. There was the Babylonians, but then there was the Persians, and then there was the Greeks, and then there was the Roman Republic, and then there was the Roman Empire. And these were all clear differences between these, and we'll notice those as we go. We'll also notice things like the rise of the synagogue. Again, I've mentioned it, but why did Paul go to the synagogue whenever he went into a new city? Who was there? Why was it important? And where did it come from? As like I said, it wasn't something that God commanded. He didn't give them laws on how to build a synagogue. It was a tradition that they had developed while they were in Babylon. And so we'll look at that. Also, the development of these Jewish divisions. We think sometimes of the Pharisees and Sadducees because they're always linked on this side against Jesus. We often think of them as a team together. But before Jesus, they were diametrically opposed. I mean, one was on this side and one was way over there on the other side. But then Jesus comes on the scene, and he was the common enemy between the two, and so they kind of link up. And then after Jesus, they went back to fighting, bickering, that sort of thing that they did. But understanding their development will kind of give us a better understanding of their mindset as well. And also, as I've said, the paving, we'll notice the paving of the way for the New Testament as we know it. There's a common language that's there. This was not a time of peace, although this was called the Roman peace. In a general way, there wasn't any war going on, but locally, there was always disturbances. There was political unrest during this time period. After Jesus, about 40 years later, Rome is done with the revolutions in this time period, and they're going to come and wipe Jerusalem off the map because they've revolted so many times here in this part of the world. The introduction of crucifixion. We don't read of anyone in the Old Testament being crucified. That wasn't really something that they did. It had to be invented and perfected is the wrong way to look at it, I suppose. But the Persians were the first ones to say, hey, if we put a stick in the ground straight up and we tied someone's hands to the top of that stick and just let them hang there with their hands above their head, that would be really painful. And then someone else said, yeah, let's do that, but let's put them in like a cross. Let's stretch their arms out and tie their arm. And then someone else came along and said, yeah, but let's put nails in. And so that develops, and by the time of Jesus, they have made it to where they can, perfected, I guess is the right word. They've made it to where they can do it so well. And that's an important, again, the fullness of time had come. And also the widespread messianic hope. Everybody had a different idea of who the Messiah was going to be, and Jesus did not fit most people's idea of who that was. And when we study this time period, we'll see some of that, and hopefully we'll understand that better. Almost made the whole time. That's good. Always good when you have PowerPoint and it goes the link there. Questions or comments? If you're not sure about it, stick with me, and we'll see. We'll get some things going here. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
One thing you did mention earlier was a puppet government during that time of kings. And in the scripture, if I'm not mistaken, it calls it a vassal king.
Yeah. Sure, right. Yeah, when Babylon came in 606, they took over. They put someone in charge that was going to kind of do what they wanted. A vassal king is the more official term. A puppet king is another way of looking at it. And each one, I'm in charge, but I'm really doing what Babylon said. So yeah, that's who that is. I keep thinking Jehoiakim. I'm gonna go sit down. Coniah is one of the words that the Old Testament uses. That just popped into my head. Anybody else while I struggle with memory here? All right, thank you so much. I appreciate your attention, and we'll keep going with this, hopefully, and it will be of interest to you. Thank you.